Well, a very good evening and welcome. Absolutely delighted to see you all. Uh, you know, Pramod, the moving force, the brain behind this think tank and the coffee house debate, which he has started, and this is the second session of the coffee house debate, is a little under the weather. So he usually does try his best to come up to say hello. But it is such a joy that people of or panelists of your distinction are participating. We had last Sunday the first session of the coffee house debate, and very rightly, Mr. Jaiswal has chosen the subject of the American elections. We had a very good discussion, but I'm sure today will be as energetic, as meaningful, and one is looking forward to it. Now, all of you, you are all associated with either associated with India or have some understanding of India and South Asia for that matter. And South Asia is looking like the rest of the world very closely at the outcome of the American elections. What happens in the US is of tremendous significance to us all. Every time I've served in the US and been I'm an expert in the US, as I was telling Kim, because I predicted Hillary Clinton will win. So with that kind of credentials, I know that every time elections are held in the US, or for that matter in India or Nepal or any other democratic country, it seems that this is the most important election in history. But indeed, the world is at crossroads. We have the health crisis, which has confronted the world. There is the economic not meltdown, but deep recession. And then there is an expansionist power in the Indo-Pacific region, which wants to introduce a new paradigm of relationships and not rule by or not have relationships based on rule of law, but rule of force. So that is the background in which the world literally is at crossroads, and we are awaiting and looking at very closely at the American elections, what it brings up, what it throws up. We have had a very interesting period of having a colorful president who has introduced a new norm, new normal, introduced something very new to the diplomatic world called the alternative facts. And the kind of rhetoric that we see in the elections is quite unusual. Now, there are things which we understand, things we do not understand. There are important trends that are shaping. The early voting is something that is quite impressive. 22 million votes cast till Friday morning, as against 6 million votes in the same period in 2016. It seems that the enthusiasm in the voter is palpable. Now, whether the democratic voter will come out to vote as he or she is doing at the moment is a big question. What will be the disposition of the next incumbent of the White House towards China, towards Iran, towards Russia are important questions. Will we see continuity? Will we see a change? Because international relations are based on continuity and a sense of, and you have an anticipation, or you believe that there is a certain structure that norms that will be followed, and suddenly there has been a huge disruption. So there are lots of moving pieces. There are very few answers, and I have sent a number of questions to all of you which you may want to weave in into your address if you like. Otherwise, you are absolutely at liberty to take up whatever you want to talk about. Now, we will start off with David, and we'll go by the alphabetical order in terms of your first names. I will request everybody to limit their opening remarks to about 10 minutes. And, I, like a good school teacher, I will time it. And, with my very gentle voice, I will interject at 8 minutes to say time 8 minutes. And that will be a gentle hint to all of you to try to wind up in 2. We will take about 1 hour to have the initial remarks, and also to maybe I'll pose a query and request for a quick response. And thereafter, we will play it by the ear. We could either have an interactive session amongst us, or we could invite questions from the floor. With this short introduction, opening remarks, may I once again welcome you all. And David, the floor is yours. Let me briefly introduce David for the benefit of the participants. He is the chair for the Department of Public Affairs in the American University at Washington, a noted author and an expert in the field of security and foreign affairs. David, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I'm you would like me to unmute. That is a good idea. My remarks will perhaps be, well, I don't know if they'll be any better unmuted than muted, but one can always hope. In any case, I'm very honored to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's actually early morning here in Washington, D.C., and we are entering roughly the final 2 weeks of the campaign. Our campaigns in the United States go on for months and months. One can argue that our presidential campaigns really start almost the day after the previous one ends, or certainly they begin the day after the midterm congressional elections. So it's almost hard to believe that this one is coming to an end at long last. Let me try and touch on a number of subjects very briefly. First, I imagine many of you are curious to know what's going on with the election. Having learned through my teaching how to use some Zoom tools, let me share the screen, and hopefully you can you all see this?
Yes.
Yes. All right. So this is sort of an aggregation of the best polls in the US. And it shows sort of the trend of the race over time. And as you can see, the incumbent president is in a bad place. He's at about 42% of the vote, as opposed to former Vice President Biden is about 52% of the vote. And in fact, in the past month has gone up from about a 7% lead to a little over 10%, which has held. 2 events have really driven the increase. First, the first debate was really a disaster for Mr. Trump. He essentially tried to dominate the debate by constantly interrupting, being, I don't know how to describe it, very rude, obnoxious, and just very much in his style to show that he was kind of the top dog, as we say. And it really didn't go over well with people, and even more over time, it alienated people, particularly female voters did not seem to like it. And they are voters he's very much needed to win back. And if anything, they went further away. The second thing that happened not too long after the debate is he caught the coronavirus. And since he's been endlessly telling the American people it's going away and getting better, the fact that he proved unable to protect even himself against it seemed yet another factor that really harmed him. Another thing that's ultimately going on is the number of cases of coronavirus here in the US, which remains obviously a central issue, is rising again and rapidly hitting as high a level as it's hit previously in the United States. And just that among the advanced industrialized nations, I think as is well known, we have really signally failed to deal with the pandemic. President Trump continues to try and convince the American people otherwise, but you know, in a way, he set himself up to disappoint precisely because he's continually told the American people we are turning the corner. You know, you know, he constantly says it's about to be over, but in fact, it's not. The number of deaths, however, has declined because he has correctly said that we are discovering, you know, as the pandemic has gone on, we've learned better how to treat it through various therapeutics and understood better how to prevent deaths, but that doesn't mean that deaths aren't continuing to occur. You know, we're now at about 220,000 Americans have died from the pandemic. And obviously many people, even if they've lived, are going to suffer long-term health problems. We continue to suffer from its effects. The other major issue, I would say, which is obviously highly related, is the economy. The economic effect have really exacerbated what is sort of an ongoing problem in the United States, which is sort of the increasing bifurcation between the better off and the less well off, or perhaps a better way is the shrinking of the middle class, which is you see increasingly sort of the middle class shrinking with more going into what you might call the upper middle class or the wealthy, and more going into lower level service jobs. Okay, and having it, you know, and sort of seeing their income stagnate or go down, and in the pandemic, moving even into poverty and having trouble going onto food lines, not having enough to eat, leaving the labor force, and so forth. And so this remains a real problem. The inability of our Congress and the president to agree on a new stimulus package has been another real problem. And President Trump changes his mind on what he wants to do almost literally on an hourly basis on this. And one day he tweeted, "No more negotiations until after the elections." 2 hours later, he says he wants to write a check to every American. Another 2 hours later, he says he wants a big package. His own caucus, however, in Congress says they don't want a big package. And what you see a bit with that is his ability to intimidate Republicans, which was previously quite strong, seems to be waning because they see him perhaps as losing. And so that is really quite interesting. So those, I would say, you know, the virus and the economy are very dominant issues for voters. Other voters have their specific concerns depending on, you know, what they're interested in, be it, but a very dominant concern increasingly are often racial issues related to the Black Lives Matter movement, I would add. Generally gained a lot of traction in the US. There is definitely a segment of the public that's thought that it's perhaps gone too far. There is a widespread level of support, I would say, though the level of support varies among the public and different people want different things out of it, but seems to be a big issue. Others are very concerned about the environment, and there's a million other concerns because there's millions of Americans. One last thing about a couple other things about the election. As you may, our election is really 51 or more separate elections. every state and the District of Columbia votes separately. And leaving aside Maine and Nebraska, where I'll spare you the details unless someone asks, they're all winner take all. And so states like mine, so Maryland, for example, is very Democratic, and we know it will vote Democratic. And similarly, we know West Virginia will vote very Republican. And so people are very focused on the swing states because you essentially, the electoral votes, the number of which each state is allocated a certain number based on the number of representatives it has in the House and Senate, add up. And so we're focused on those. There's a certain bias in the system that probably will allow Mr. Trump to win, I should say President Trump to win, even if he loses the popular vote by several percent. At this point, Vice President Biden leads by such an amount that seems highly unlikely, but you have to see how the people vote. Just like, we've seen in countries like India, at the end of the day, it's what the people say, not what the polls say. And sometimes we get interesting surprises. The polls, however, I will say, have been corrected for the errors that they made last time, which were that they didn't take into account the division among whites between low and high education voters. And so that, I would say, has probably been corrected. And that the reality at this point is, even if they miss by as much, by a fair amount in either direction, Mr. Biden seems likely to win. I also want to point out all of our House of Representatives is up for election, and so is 1/3 of the Senate. You really want to watch the Senate this year because that is going to be rather close. The Democrats seem sure to retain control of the House, but if Vice President Biden wins, if he wants to have any hope of getting his agenda passed, he has to win control of the Senate. It seems that in terms of, I guess to sort of sum up on the voter base, President Trump in some ways in the future, if things continue to go as they look as, is sort of a case study of he's absolutely maintained his voter base, okay, of 42 to 43%. Okay, and that they seem unlikely to go anywhere, and that his whole campaign has been based on kind of all we need is more Trump, and more Trump being Trump. Okay, but he has done absolutely nothing to win over the swing voters, and indeed, it's been almost an object lesson on how to hand them to Mr. Biden, who has spent most of the campaign after he sort of consolidated his party and worked to, reunite with the left wing of his party. He then moved to now appealing to the center of the country and essentially presenting a contrast of himself as empathetic and able to reunite our extremely polarized, divided country and present sort of he wants to present himself as a more normal personality as opposed to Vice President Biden. Been asked to touch a bit on some foreign policy.
David,
Am I out of time?
can I do my usual bit of saying 30 seconds, please?
30 seconds. Okay, no worries.
Now.
Okay, foreign policy has not been big in the election, but in terms of how it will change, I think what Vice President Biden will do is try and, if elected, is try to reestablish stronger ties with our traditional allies and also with other democracies. He will also reprioritize human rights to a greater extent. He will also try and perhaps, I would argue, stabilize ties with countries like China and put them on a more normal basis. There will still be, conflicts over some real differences, including human rights, including Taiwan, and particularly Hong Kong and the treatment of the Uyghurs, which President Trump has ignored. But he may want to try and find a way to resolve our real trade differences rather than continue a trade war. And I know us professors tend to rattle on, so I will rattle off at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. You have kicked off the discussion brilliantly. you've touched upon. You've gone straight to the heart of the matter, and all the points that you have made are very crucial to the discussion at hand. Now, let me pose a question to you and request you for a brief reply within 2 minutes. And also the other panelists could weigh in, because it's a very important point that you made about the American economy, that the middle class is shrinking, that inequity is increasing, and yet Trump scores more with the people, according to opinion polls, on the economy. There seems to be more confidence that the people have in him in handling the economy over Joe Biden. How do you explain that?
Well, he inherited a good economy from President Obama, and essentially he spent a ton of money, which helped keep the economy going all right. So the confidence in the two of them is roughly about the same. He may be slightly ahead, I would say, President Trump. A lot of the differences in the economy also, increasingly what's interesting is he's supported by the sort of lower class white voters increasingly, and that has to do with more identity issues, that the Democrats, because they appeal a lot to racial minorities, I think a lot of white lower class people feel like they're ignored, and they may also feel that their status is challenged by the rise of other minority groups, and that historically, you know, whites were the dominant group in this country, and you know, they're both white and not successful. And so, you know, some of it is racism, some of it is just discontent that, wait, I have problems too, would you pay attention to me? Okay, so, and I would separate out the two of them. President Trump, however, has clearly played directly on racist sentiment. I don't think one can dispute that.
Thank you. Any other panelists would like to weigh in? Could please unmute herself and go ahead, please. On this particular aspect, Namrata, Rolly.
Yes.
Yeah, first Namrata, then Rolly. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great question. And I think in terms of the economy, so if you look at the Pew Research survey, they did a survey last month in which they looked at what are the issues that voters think are important. And so what came out, and this is registered voters from Democratic side and Republican side. So in terms of a cumulative assessment, and Pew gives us great surveys of how do you think about these issues. And so they said that in terms of the economy, the Republican Party, not just Trump, has scored better. So the survey is available. And I think that's historic. So they see the Republican Party as better on taxes in terms of regulation. And in fact, it holds a 9 percentage point edge over the Democratic Party on the issue of handling the economy better.
Right.
So it's interesting that they see the Republican Party as handling the economy better. And I think that we should think about that, because in terms of the issue that the voters said are going to be important in the election on November 3rd, economy is actually number 1. So we have to see how that will get reflected.
Thank you. Rolly?
Yeah, I was just going to support a couple things that David said. I do think that the racial issue is critical here. I don't think that necessarily the lower middle class of the white population in America is actually doing necessarily better than before Trump. It's just that he is really, really advocating for the fact that, hey, you may not be doing better. He's not saying that. He's saying you are doing better. But in actuality, what he's really arguing is, well, you know, I care about you, not so much the poor Blacks. And they appreciate that attention. And that's why his divisiveness is actually playing as a positive for, I think, the lower white middle class. And yeah, we'll talk about the economy more later. Just wanted to add that in.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Kim Nazareth to speak on the subject. And also she has just submitted her thesis on JCPOA. So I'll request her to touch upon that or talk about some aspects of JCPOA also. She is with the Center of American Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you. It's really amazing to be here and share a panel with such distinguished professors and researchers in their field. So yes, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you. So I would just touch upon a little bit of, I mean, primarily I'll be talking about a little bit of foreign policy mixed with domestic policy, because you can't do one without the other. And so the way in which I see Trump's foreign policy, or President Trump's foreign policy, is what Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House in the 1980s, said, which was all politics is local. Everything that you do on the world stage is mostly geared towards something happening on your domestic front. And I think that epitomizes President Trump's foreign policy. If you look at everything right from what he said in 2016 as a candidate to right up to now, what he's been saying, it has changed here and there and so on and so forth. But in most cases, he's tried to pander to his domestic base of the Midwest, of the South, of those states that actually are purely red states and have no chance of changing blue. So, or even, even for that, for instance, his victory in 2016 with the Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and all of that, which were the blue wall, which the Democrats call their blue wall. It was only in that offshoot election that you find President Trump winning, because primarily Democrats had always taken that, right from Bill Clinton through Obama, even through George Bush. Even in all of that, you have the blue wall standing very firmly behind the Democrats. And here was this offshoot election, this strange election that all of us felt went really haywire for everybody, for the whole world, in fact. But here's the thing, he's always pandered, he's always going to focus on his base. Everything he says and does has international implications, no doubt. We're not doubting those international implications, but they're purely to ignite his base of voters that say, yes, what Trump is doing is absolutely right, and what Biden is going to do is absolutely false. You can see that from, I think, a couple of hours ago, I was looking through my news feed, and I saw all of these, the feed about Hunter Biden and all of that, and his Russian connection and so on and so forth. I mean, we've passed the October surprise. Now we're having another October surprise, which shouldn't be actually very surprising considering what happened in 2016 as well, when Hillary Clinton's emails were being looked at and so on and so forth. But these are all the ways in which President Trump loves to ignite his base. And even on the foreign policy side, look at the way he's talked about China. Look at the way he's talked about Russia. Look at the way he talks about Iran. Those are all, I mean, I'm no doubt they're all certain issues that he has, probably meaningful issues that he has with those countries. I'm not saying no, but that has been, and this is the way I see it, is purely to ignite a base of voters to vote for him. Also, to ignite your Congress, your Republican Congress, and pander to them as well. So he finds this really exciting, and he thinks, and for some reason, I don't know what, but he really thinks that by saying these things and doing certain things, that he actually garners the support of all of America. For instance, with Russia, at one angle, he talks about Russia as, in a negative light, and talks about the way in which Putin is behaving and so on and so forth, and criticizes Putin at some points. And then at the same time, he disregards the Inspector General on intelligence and says, no, Putin had nothing to do with the election. Putin's interference in the election was nil. And you find this stark differences between his comments, and he gets away with it. That's the strange part. He makes these dichotomous arguments, and he gets away with it. Now, for instance, they're looking at the renewal of the New START, which is another big issue for the United States and Russia, and the future of nuclear agreements or whatever it is. And you find him dwindling and saying, I can get a better deal, which is the art of the deal, I guess. But you find that, again, being a way of saying, I can negotiate a better deal, one that will favor the United States and not Russia. In the same way, you find the trade wars between China and the United States. I can get a better trade deal. I can do better with China. I can bring China to its knees. I can negotiate with China from a point of strength, from a position of strength and influence. And yet he managed to nearly bring down the American economy in terms of the Rust Belt states, which are actually agrarian in some ways, and all the agrarian states in the South, etc., all suffered because of this humongous trade war that was ongoing with China. And then he had to give them subsidies and bail them out and whatever. And on the Iran front, which is my pet peeve, it's hilarious. I mean, I find it really very sad because you have a deal, and by no means is it a perfect deal, but it was a deal put in place which also garnered international recognition. And you see President Trump in the beginning of his administration trying to adhere to the deal. And, at the same time, he talks negatively about the deal, and his rhetoric against the deal is very fierce, calling it the worst deal in the world and so on and so forth. And I can get you a better deal and so on and so forth. And he continues the deal to adhere to the deal for a couple of months, for maybe a year or so, and then walks out of that deal. And then imposes sanctions not only on Iran, but threatens other countries that do business with Iran, especially your allies in Europe, which is France and Britain and all of your allies in Europe, that we will sanction your countries or your companies and so on and so forth, including India, if you were to continue doing business with Iran. So for instance, India had to buy oil from other countries as well, and could no longer buy oil from Iran.
Kim, 2 minutes, please.
Yes. So to wrap up, for me, I think even with NATO, for instance, and your organizations, your WTO and other international, intergovernmental organizations, you find that his rhetoric towards these organizations, his actions towards many of these organizations is purely to ignite a base and that continued support towards that base. So for me, Trump's foreign policy has been solely based on that base. Yeah, I'm
Oh, wow. Well, you have 1 minute and 5 seconds in your bank account. Use it whenever you want to. Brilliant. We really have enjoyed your impassioned assessment of Trump's foreign policy, his disposition. Yes, I think he has taught the world of diplomacy a few lessons of how not to conduct diplomacy. So that is one of the biggest lessons that one takes away. And his approach has been very bare knuckle, which has been something new, quite unusual, except it worked in North Korea, because North Korea never saw, this kind of a language coming from Washington. So for once, Kim Jong-un I think he was a little apprehensive of what came next. But President Trump did ruffle quite a few feathers. That is very true. Now, I agree with you on both the counts that, all politics is local, and that President Trump pandered to his voter base. But my question to you and other panelists is that, isn't that the bane of democracy? I would like to know which democratic leader does not pander to his voters base. And, so that has always been the case. And when you talk about Trump and Russia, let us remind ourselves what President Bush said once when he was standing in the Rose Garden. He said that, and cameras were rolling, and Mr. Bush said that he had looked into the soul of Putin and found a God-fearing person. So, there have been many such instances, but would you like to comment on that? And then I'll request my fellow panelists also to comment on whether in democracies, is it possible, or in today's world, for a leader not to pander to his voters base, as you said? Kim?
Right. Thank you for the question. So the thing is that, this is what I feel and what I think is that Republicans, yes, Republicans and Democrats alike have pandered to voter bases in the United States. And yes, they and this especially on the domestic side, they do that with their to pandering to their voter base. And for instance, your tax cuts for the upper class and so on and so forth. But this is the first time that it has been done at a very foreign policy level, because even George Bush, for all his conservatism, for all of that, he did acknowledge that America's role in the world, or America's role in the international community, as well as striking deals with countries. Now, I'm not saying he would have wanted to make a deal with Iran, obviously. I'm not saying that, because he called it the axis of evil in his State of the Union address. But what I'm talking about is even towards his relations with NATO, etc. He was not that blatant of talking about burden sharing. Even if he talked a bit here and there about burden sharing, it was not the way in which Trump has been talking about and walking out of the UN Human Rights Council and walking out of this deal and that deal and the Paris Peace Climate Agreement, etc. Blatant overshow of trying to flex his muscle.
You're very right. In fact, the Human Rights Council has got some champions of the human rights, namely Pakistan and China and so on. So you are absolutely right about the Human Rights Council.
Yeah,
Thank you. Any other panelist would like to make a comment? Yes, David, sir, please go right ahead, unmute yourself. And David, while you are at it, and other panelists also, not a related question, but you had made one very interesting point about Trump's support base remaining intact and he not having tried to expand it. Some experts believe that Trump's base may have frayed a bit, and especially the white American women who had voted for President Trump in numbers may not be as amenable or interested this time. Would you and the other panelists comment on that also, whether the base has been impacted to a little extent? Go ahead, sir.
Oh gosh, I don't think I can do foreign policy and American women in 2 minutes.
Okay, you have 2.5 minutes. How is that?
Well, okay. I would just note there's
Take my 1 minute.
oh, well, I would note in addition, certainly President Trump has been very interested in foreign policy to the extent he can use it to augment his support in key domestic state, as Professor Nas said. But also, a constant thread we've noticed over here is his adoration for more autocratic leaders and his seeming disdain for our traditional democratic allies. I mean, even from close nations like Canada, and Americans traditionally find Canadians as the most inoffensive people in the world. We tend to say they're just like us, which makes them cringe, but we mean as a compliment. You know, and I would say, to be honest, North Korea is an example of his failure. Kim Jong-un flattered him repeatedly with sort of literally these sort of flattering love letters almost. Sanctions have been weakened. He gave him these high-profile meetings that no American leader has given. And meanwhile, he continued building his nuclear program and now has intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so, I mean, a complete failure. As you highlighted, the Iran deal, whatever you thought of the original deal, what we have now is unquestionably not better than the original deal. And so, you know, he seems to really like autocratic leaders, mainly it just doesn't, you know, he's frayed these ties, and it seems very much based on personal relationships, and he thinks he can sort of flatter people into doing his will, but he's actually not terribly respected. I think he doesn't realize that.
I'm sorry to interject. Could you comment on the voter base of President Trump, whether you see that has shrunk, and also, if possible, about the leaders weighing in more the interests of their voters or their base than the nation as a whole?
What you have to realize is that what's changed in America to a great extent is our media has become more segmented. And so there is now this kind of conservative media universe led by Fox News and certain radio commentators that provide this kind of alternative universe of both facts and commentary. And so as a result, you know, whereas in the past people might have different views, we kind of had an agreement on the basic facts of the day, you might say. And so now there's a disagreement even on kind of what happened on the day, and also what events are worthy of notice.
Fair enough.
And so I would say, in terms of, you know, you asked about women, I think a lot of it is both his behavior and also that the coronavirus pandemic combined with his behavior has directly affected so many people so negatively, you know, and families and health. And, you know, women are often in charge in households of dealing with these issues. So, and, you know, they're finding it very difficult to deal with because they are in fact difficult to deal with. Even if you have resources, managing like the children at home 24 hours a day is not easy.
Point taken. Yeah, thanks. Any other panelists would like to comment on these two aspects? No? All right. With that, I would then like to invite Dr. Namrata Goswami to take the floor. She's an international defense and security expert based in Montgomery with the Futures Lab. Is that correct?
Yes, but I have my own independent consultancy. I do some work for them.
Lovely. You may want to talk of your consultancy also, but the floor is yours. Go right ahead.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you, Sri Prakash, and thank you, NICE, for hosting this very interesting panel. It's uniquely, it is actually unique that I got up at 6:30 in the morning in Montgomery, Alabama to talk about US elections. So you can see how excited I am about it. So, so I think what I would do in my 10 minutes is take up some of your questions that you raised, Sri Prakash, because I thought they were interesting to see how our audience that is actually joined in would also want to weigh in terms of some of the conceptual problems or issues that we have. So for one, as David mentioned, and also Kim mentioned before we started this particular conversation, is that in this election, the swing states will play the most major role. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery has a Black mayor, the first African-American mayor who's a Democratic Party member. But we also have Doug Jones, who's a Democratic senator, but the state is Republican and will vote Republican. And so California will vote Democratic. But I think the important point is that the key states, for instance, the swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida will play a critical role in terms of who will be the United States' next president. And if you look at the poll numbers, Biden leads in Michigan by 10 points over Trump, in Pennsylvania by 5%, in Wisconsin by about 6%, Florida about 3%, and Arizona about 4%. So if you see that he's leading, but the fact that these are swing states and some of the methodological issues that 538 pointed out is that sometimes you might not be reaching out to some of the voter base, or they might not be giving you the actual answer as to who they are voting for. So, and so we need to account for that particular outlier or error. I think one thing that the polls have done, people keep talking that in 2016, Hillary Clinton was ahead by an equal margin of 10% over Trump, and yet Trump won the Electoral College. He didn't win the popular vote. But I think what the polling companies have done is that they have now reached out to the low-income, low-educated voters that they supposedly missed, surprisingly, in the 2016 election. And so the jury is still out there, but the polls clearly indicate that Biden is ahead. The question is, will he hold the Electoral College? So for the benefit of the audience in the United States, you do not win the presidency if you win the popular vote. You might win the popular vote, but you might still lose the election if you do not win the Electoral College. Now, in terms of addressing some of the questions you raised, for instance, this is a key question. So will a Biden, let's take a hypothetical scenario. We have a President Biden. So will Biden rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran that was signed under the Obama-Biden presidency? So I was looking up some of his very good articles he's actually put out in terms of foreign policy, and he's clearly committed to rejoining the deal with Iran. He says that if he becomes president, it'll be the first thing he'll do is to rejoin the Comprehensive Plan of Action, because in his perspective, that is what held back Iran's investment in its nuclear weapons technology. But he also gives an interesting qualifier that it will also depend on if Iran is willing to recommit to an unpredictable scenario of US commitment to a deal. So that's number one. In terms of North Korea, so what he points out is that he would not go with the unilateral kind of approach that has been adopted by the Trump administration with regard to North Korea. He would actually continue with the negotiations with North Korea to ensure that North Korea does not threaten the United States mainland, but it will be more in terms of a multilateral approach, which will also include China. So, and that's very clear. He says that he will continue with an extension of the New START Treaty, which he views as a strategic anchor with Russia in terms of arms control. And so the other important foreign policy issue, which our audience would be very interested in, is that Biden says that as soon as he becomes president, the United States will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord on day one. So, and then of course, historically, Democrats have always believed in democratic alliances, support of NATO. And so he points out that he will form a key democratic alliance in terms of foreign policy. He will undo many of President Trump's immigration policies, especially the, pulling children off from parents, his very hardcore policy in terms of how much refugees the United States is going to take. And the most important issue, especially for those undocumented members of the US Armed Forces who have faced deportation under the Trump administration, Biden argues that he would undo such policies. Now, in terms of, so if you look at the impact of, so coming from foreign policy, so those are the basic Biden differences that we will see. Both are committed to a good relationship with India. So as you know, it started under Clinton, the reaching out to India as a strategic partner. Bush continued with that particular foreign policy. Obama actually visited India twice, was the first US president to be invited to take part in a Republic Day celebration by Modi. And Trump also has upgraded the relationship with India in terms of a strategic partnership. Now, the second question you raised, I thought was interesting. So did President Trump's ailment, especially the COVID-19 diagnosis, have any impact on his campaign? So I was looking up his campaign website, and guess what the picture is there? Is a picture of President Trump's head in the body of a boxer. And the argument he's giving out to his base is that he has beaten the coronavirus very fast. And I think one of the concerns that was raised by the campaign was that if President Trump does not visibly demonstrate himself to his voter base after COVID-19 diagnosis, that might create anxiety within them and might give people the impression that he's not getting well. So he made it very poignantly clear that he's getting better. He gave several videos through his Twitter to his base, including those independents who are concerned. And also he has now started campaigning. Now, your question about what are the issues weighing on the mind of the voter? And for that, I think data analysis like Pew is very interesting and gives you a great survey, and as well as 538. So I think in terms of the Pew Research survey, the most important issue that is impacting voters across the aisle, be it Democratic or Republican, there might be differences in terms of percentage, is the economy. So number one is the economy, number two is healthcare, and guess what is number three? It's Supreme Court appointments.
No.
So that's becoming an important issue of concern as well. Coronavirus is actually number four. I thought it would be number one, but that's the number four issue. Violent crime is the number fifth issue. The sixth issue is foreign policy. The seventh issue is gun policy. Eighth issue is racial and ethnic equality, especially after the disastrous George Floyd incident. Immigration is number 9. Economic inequality is number 10. Climate change is number 11. And abortion is a very important issue in terms of what voters are voting for. And in terms of abortion, it's very clear. The Republican Party is pro-life. The Democratic Party is pro-choice. So you can see the clear distinction in terms of what issues are basically galvanizing the voter. Now, here is a clear distinction.
2 minutes, please.
Sure. So for Trump supporters, the economy, 88%, and violent crime, 74%, are the most salient issues. And roughly 6 in 10 Trump supporters cite immigration, 61%, gun policy, 60%, and foreign policy, 57%, as very important for their vote. Now, this is where the contrast comes. For Biden supporters, it is not in terms of what do they focus, in terms of who they're going to vote for. Coronavirus outbreak becomes important suddenly, despite the fact that economy still holds the key national level indicator. But state by state, coronavirus is 82%. And then in terms of economy, the Biden voters actually think that racial equality, healthcare, affordable healthcare, in fact, universal healthcare becomes significantly important from their perspective. Now, as I mentioned before, in terms of a national-wide survey, Republicans lead on the economy, but Democrats have advantage on climate, health, racial issues. Now, in terms of relations with China, Russia under a new president, in my perspective, since I study China very closely, I do a lot of work on China in terms of space. My book just came out with Roman and Littlefield called Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, just out yesterday. So I would think that Biden would continue his focus on China, might not be in the high level of trade escalation, but he would continue to raise issues like human rights issues. He would continue to raise issues like unfair trade practices. But I think what would be different in terms of dealing with China would be that Biden would adopt a more multilateral approach, unlike Trump, who's gone for a very unilateral approach. Now, finally, in terms of internal issue that, again, where there is a great difference in terms of perspective. And this, I think, has key, I had conversations with voters across the aisle in Montgomery, Alabama. One of the issues which, again, divides the voter base in terms of internal issue is issues like capital punishment and crime. So for Trump, he wants to continue with the immunity to police officers in terms of law enforcement. And I think it is also important that he highlights himself as a law and order president, especially in the context of his, and this is not my perspective, but his clever campaigning, showing cities that were burning during the protests, whereas actual data shows that the protest has been very peaceful. Whereas Biden has pointed out that he would like to actually rethink on the immunity principle for police reform. And finally, I'll end by saying that even in terms of just crime, levels of crime imposition, the Democratic Party wants to do away with capital punishment, but the Republican Party wants to continue with that. I'll end there, and I look forward to a discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a brilliant exposition. You have been succinct, you have been pithy, you have covered a lot of aspects that are of interest to South Asia and many of us who have a lot of interest in the US, particularly what you mentioned about the outlook of Vice President Joe Biden is very welcome. If even half of what he has said and promised is implemented, I guess it will bring a lot of joy and relief to various parts of the world. Now, two aspects that I would like to open up for a brief conversation. One is the race relations, and there is also a question we have from the audience. Let's weave that in. The question is, how will the Floyd case impact the US elections? How much is healthcare, minority issues, and employment, security, social security being raised during the US elections? So to you and the other panelists, if you'd like to comment on the race relations, whether that is also going to motivate the voter to come out, especially the Black voter, because even in the early polls, there are indications that they have come out in great numbers. And a related matter is whether the Kamala Harris factor will also galvanize the African-American voter. That is one. About opinion polls, we know that they can be highly uncertain, and one of the things that are being one of the arguments that is being branded about is that the Republican voter is consciously misleading the pollsters and is not disclosing his or her mind, and so they are getting it wrong. But you know, the Republicans are going to come out in very large numbers to vote on the D-Day. Your comments, and then I would invite other panelists also to comment on that. Namrata.
Sure, thank you. I think I think the George Floyd, on the disastrous dealing, especially the death of George Floyd, has had a deep impact in terms of the conversation around race. So I live in a city, Montgomery, which saw the famous Rosa Parks boycott. We have downtown is 10 minutes away. We have symbols of that. We have the famous church where Martin Luther King gave his conversations on how you need to have racial equality. We have the Selma March. So this is a very historic city. And so the conversation here was that Clinton was not able to actually bring out the Black vote. She was seen as hard on crime because of her historic, a bill that she supported in the 1990s. And so I think she was not able to galvanize the Black vote as Obama and Biden were able to do. I think given the effect of the race, issue, the Black vote, especially the young vote, is going to come out. And they've already come out, especially in swing states like North Carolina, Georgia, which is close by Alabama. By the way, Doug Jones won in Alabama because of the Black vote in Birmingham, Jefferson County, and Montgomery. So because he was able to galvanize that. So I think they will play a major part. And the African-American population constitutes about 13% of the US population, which is a major percentage in terms of swing votes. And so I think that's going to play a lead role. What was your second question, Sri Prakash?
About the opinion polls that they may or may not be able to capture the mood of the nation.
That's always a concern in terms of methodology, because these are national level phone calls. There are, especially COVID-19 situation, the ability to do person-to-person polling could not be there. And so that's why I say that we always have to account for the fact that polls might go wrong. But historically, if you look at the record of polls, they have been correct. The only time that they were absolutely incorrect was because of the Trump win. My concern is that, and this is a concern as a researcher I have, and that is that if you have pollings done with a bias of looking for what you want, and not really looking out for what you do not like, but still want to account for, that might actually create disinformation as well. And that happened in 2016. The Atlantic came out and said that most of the polls that were conducted did not actually even want to talk to the white, uneducated, pro-Trump, in their perspective, people who were uninformed. And so I'm sure that has been corrected, but we don't know. We don't know what might tip the balance in the last 2 weeks.
You're very right. In fact, the world over, the pollster's bias does creep in willy-nilly. So that is the challenge. Any of my other friends wants to weigh in? No? All right. Well, with this, we have been saving the best for the last. And with great pleasure, I invite Dr. Roli Lal to take the floor. She's with the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. And if I may, Roli, can I also request you to comment on the India-US relations in that? Do you see it is more a bilateral pull factor in the relationship, given the synergies, etc., or is it more external factors, i.e. to bring India on board as a counterweight to rising power or counterweight to China in the US calculus? If you would like to comment on that also, that will be nice, but the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I just took a note of that. So when I get to foreign policy, I'm going to touch upon that. Thank you. So I want to start off, though, with domestic policy, because I do think that that is going to be the critical issue in this election. Of course, it's going to be a mix. I think the two main factors are going to be a mix of the coronavirus and the economy. And I think that it's really hard to separate out these two variables and how they fit into how they impact on President Trump in particular. Because what we're seeing is that with the coronavirus, it has been obvious to a lot of the US population, especially in urban areas and larger states, that it's been an abject failure. We have a lot of dead people and it is continuing, whereas President Trump had said early on it was going to be taken care of, it was going to disappear magically and all this type of thing. It obviously did not do so. And then to make things worse, of course, Trump got sick with the coronavirus, and this did not help his image. And as mentioned earlier, of course, he made a very strong effort to fix that image by putting out photos and so forth, saying, yes, I've gotten this fixed. But, you know, Americans did notice that he received much better health care than the rest of the US. The type of drugs and treatment that he received is not something that is typical or affordable for Americans. So I think that is one arena of coronavirus. There is also the fact that you see in the news, the White House was greatly infected after the Rose Garden event, senators also. So you see that there's just this snowballing all the way into the red states. So whereas for a long time, for months running, President Trump was able to get away with this, I think with a lot of the intermediate, sort of not really Republican or Democrat voters, by saying, well, you know, it's just the New Yorkers and Californians and big cities that are being hit. However, at this time, we're seeing a lot of rising cases in rural areas and out west and down south, and that really isn't helping his case that much. Even some of his very core supporters, such as Chris Christie, got COVID and said, hey, you know, you need to wear a mask. So the fact that President Trump did not support these type of contact tracing policies and masking policies, I think is not helping him with those on the fence voters who are thinking of health as something that they're picking up the cost for now and maybe not being able to go to work and so forth. On the flip side, what we're seeing is that Biden says that he would make COVID coverage free, as well as implementing more contact tracing. He would put in a mask mandate. So of course, this doesn't play towards Trump's base. Biden's not going to be able to steal any Trump voters with a mask mandate, that's for sure. In fact, he might get some people out on the streets with guns with that. But nonetheless, I do think that a lot of people think that this is a logical policy that could get people to go back to work. When we look at other countries and see what has been effective, and look at the fact that, you know, China or New Zealand or many countries are able to go back to an effective daily life, you can see that the US progress on this has not been effective. So I think that the fact that he also said that he would roll back Obamacare wasn't a very astute idea, because the data show that most people are in favor of it, especially during a pandemic. And now the economy is, of course, very well mixed into this, in the sense that the economy, as a result of the pandemic, has been tanking. People have been losing their jobs. Shops and stores, even chain stores, are going bankrupt. People are laid off. What type of support are they receiving? This is also really hard on students. We're seeing college students unable to find a job after graduation, of course. We have people with student loans unable to pay them. And of course, as you may know, Americans tend to have a lot of student loans. So that is a serious issue in education, in terms of higher education. Now, in terms of lower education, we also have faced some very poor policies that are not serving Trump well. His lack of focus, and our lack of focus as a nation, on having any kind of national plan on how to roll out lower education online, or maybe in a phased approach of 2 days this way, 2 days that way, or even a televised approach, a national televised education program. There hasn't really been a real plan. And that, adding to the fact that lower income Americans, white or Black, don't necessarily have access to internet and computers at the level that they would need to actually get on board with educating their children during this crisis. You can see that it's actually been, it's a problem on the scale that people are saying, well, children have lost a year of their education. This doesn't help us move ahead in terms of competitiveness and thinking where jobs are going to go. And as mentioned earlier, the issue of women, this comes in very strongly. Women care about their children. They care about whether or not their children are in school. And the fact is, if these children are not in school, it's the women who are taking time out of the work to a large extent to make sure that these kids are getting online, doing their homework, getting some type of an education or schooling from home, as we're seeing increasingly people are doing. Now, in addition to those general economic and COVID failures, you have broader issues of the infrastructure. Trump had mentioned early on that he was going to really, fix infrastructure, make the U.S. an infrastructure giant, and he hasn't done it. Climate change, his view on climate change is clearly a problem. He has not only negated that this is a real issue. When the wildfires hit the US, especially out west in California, Colorado, Oregon, and so forth, you have homes just being burnt, people losing their jobs and their life. And his first response, especially on the California wildfires, was, no, you're not getting help. I mean, this doesn't really resonate well with Americans. When you say, well, this is not something the government's going to help you with. And I believe that he saw that this is not resonating well, and he immediately changed his stance and said, okay, California can have some aid after all. But his general approach towards the climate and the wildfires is that this is the fault of the Californian government. This is not something that we can affect as policymakers. And I don't think that most Americans agree with that stance. You also have the issue of investment in lower income communities. I would say that Biden is much more in favor of this. He says that he would, whereas Trump's main argument on the issue of lower income communities is that, hey, white women, why don't you like me? I've saved your suburbs from Black lower income people, so vote for me, please. And I don't think that is a strong argument to anybody except for some, of his very core voters. I don't think he's going to win a lot of new women with that argument, and he's certainly not going to make any progress on the minority communities. So I think that he's definitely lost women on health and education, and even in terms of this type of community issue. And talking more broadly about
2 minutes, please.
2 minutes. All right. So we've got divisiveness. His response to the protests was horrible. Use of military force was a human rights abuse. He didn't disavow the white supremacists in the first debate. People didn't like that. And the white militias are hurting his case. I don't think Americans like the vision of the US where militias try to kidnap female governors they disagree with. I actually think in this election, foreign policy is less important than ever because of these economic and pandemic issues we're dealing with. Nobody really knows what Trump's foreign policy is, except for that he admires authoritarians. North Korea, we don't really have progress. Iran, as mentioned earlier, he dropped the nuclear deal, and nobody feels that this was an effective approach. Overall, frankly, most of Europe thinks that he is an idiot, and we have lost support of our allies. In Asia is the one place where he has some approval. He has said that he is hard on China, but his tough policy on China is mainly comprised of insults about COVID. Whereas Biden is saying that he's tougher on China in terms of human rights abuses and the Hong Kong security law. And I think Biden will also make moves to get back on the relations, the JCPOA with Iran. Now, with regards to India, as you mentioned earlier, I do think that India is important for both. So I do think that Trump actually did a good job in maintaining good relations with India. And that is seen as a positive because Americans do consider, I think, India as a bit of a counterweight to China. I do think that Biden is likely to continue that. And I think that in some ways he was signaling that with his choice of Kamala Harris as a vice presidential nominee. So I think that India is going to be a factor for both governments, whichever government we end up with. I don't think that it is a critical issue in the election. But I do think that it is viewed as a counterweight to China by both the Democratic and Republican parties. It's just that the way that both parties view China itself is quite different, in the sense that the Democratic Party is much harder on them with regards to human rights. And in that sense, India upholding human rights and democratic values is going to play well in a democratic government. That's it.
Thank you very much. You have given some excellent perspectives, given us food for thought. You are spot on about foreign policy not being an important issue. In fact, as far as I know, in none of the democratic countries, foreign policy plays a big role, for the simple reason, as the political leaders and others tell you, that foreign policy does not give you votes. So it is the local policies which attract or do not attract the voter. Now, let us just decide what to. Paki, can you hear me? Or
yes, sir, you're audible.
Do we have questions from the floor? Should we continue with our discussion?
So you may continue with the discussion. I'll also look for some questions. I've been constantly looking. There are one or two questions.
All right, I would invite questions from the floor, which could either be posted in the chat box or let us know that you have a question. We'll come to you in 5 minutes, but before that, question to you, Roli, and also to other panelists. You mentioned about Kamala Harris. Now, are we likely to witness the first lady vice president in the American history? What is the kind of impact that she is going to have on the outcome, to galvanize the black voters? She is also half Indian, and it seems that almost 78% of the Indian voters, and there are about 1.8 million Indian voters, are likely to vote Democrats. But so one about Kamala Harris, there is also a lot of fear mongering going on from Trump to say that, Mr. Biden is old and he may not last, and he may just hand over the reins of power to Kamala Harris. So is there any substance in this? And also another point about what you and the other panelists made about the Electoral College, which has a mind of its own, if I were to put it differently. How big should be the lead for the winning candidate to make the outcome Electoral College proof? In other words, to not have the Electoral College supersede the popular vote. Roli, first you, and then I would invite other panelists to comment on that.
Okay, I'll comment especially on the issues of Kamala Harris. I do think that to some extent, yes, Kamala Harris was a galvanizing force for both women and minorities in particular. Having said that, it's interesting because the debate on which candidate Biden would choose in advance was a long and drawn out one. And a lot of the Black community had landed on other candidates that were not Kamala Harris, that were considered maybe more pro-Black in many ways than Kamala Harris was, because of her background as Attorney General. So she had been seen as much harsher in terms of law and order. So she is an interesting mix of kind of conservative attributes that the minority community may not have been so much in favor of. And so I heard from, in particular, it's interesting, many of my minority students even came up to me and they said, well, if he's choosing Kamala Harris for us, meaning the Black community, he'd needn't do so. Now, having said that, I do think that they're happy that he didn't choose a white person as the vice presidential candidate. So I do think that it still has served in his favor. And I do think that his strategy, I think, which was possibly of gaining some of the Indian American vote and gaining the Black vote at the same time, was probably astute. I do think that he's been able to steal a bunch of the Indian vote. As you know, the Indian American vote is very split between Democrats and Republicans because it's a very affluent community that doesn't want its taxes grabbed. So, so this is an issue, and I do think that in that sense, Kamala Harris has helped nab some of the Indian American vote. I do think that many Black Americans feel that not voting for the first time having a Black female as vice president would be going against their community. So I do think that he's going to solidify his vote in that arena. So I do think that Kamala Harris was still a very good option. She's seen as extremely capable. She has a lot of experience as a senator and as a lawmaker. And so I think that people do see her as capable if she were to become the presidential, president holder after if something were to happen to Biden. Now, what's fascinating about the sick Biden thesis is that Trump has been trying to cast him as the old sick man. Unfortunately, Trump went and got sick. So that didn't help this argument very much. And it also drew attention to the fact that their age isn't really that far from one another. They're very different, 3-4 years. And Biden looks very fit relative to Trump and his, obese illness. So I do think that actually, I think that Kamala Harris is an asset in this. And I do think that Mike Pence, in that respect, as her opponent, looks particularly not very charismatic. I don't know that people feel that inspired by the possibility of President Pence. So that's, I'll just leave that there and let others chime in.
I think, if I may.
Please, go right ahead.
Thank you. So I think Kamala Harris as a vice presidential candidate, so we still do not have the data to show the impact it has had in terms of her being included in the ticket. But I agree that given the fact that she's the first minority woman to be, to have such a position, in terms of a vice presidential candidate. I think we had a presidential candidate from an African-American woman. I'm forgetting her name. I saw this series called Mrs. America, where she was one of the characters. So, Kamala Harris, I think her past record is still remembered. And so in terms of persecution of minority communities, as her role was, but I think she's tried to kind of explain what that is. But we still do not have that kind of data. My concern comes from the fact that when she was the presidential candidate in terms of the Democratic primaries, I was looking at analysis and there was not so much enthusiasm for her in terms of her candidature. So we need to factor that in. But then the context has changed. So she's now in the ticket with Biden, and that creates a completely different dynamic. I think that Biden, as I mentioned before, with Kamala Harris, is going to be able to bring out the young vote. I see a question for me, which says that what role is the new first-time voter going to play?
Absolutely. If you could respond to that, and other panelists also, very good question from Mr. Imam. Sorry to interject about what is the kind of role that the first-time voter is going to play. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I'm noticing in terms of the divide that you had raised in one of your questions, Sri Prakash, is between age groups. So I would think that if you look at even my own family here, the difference in terms of who they are voting for is very clear. The generation, my father's generation tend to vote for Trump, are more conservative in some of the states, especially the Republican states. But what is interesting is that their grandchildren, who are the first-time voters from the same state, tends to vote for Biden and are much more concerned about climate change, are much more concerned about issues of economic equality, race relations, in terms of reflecting the 1960s, where race relation was an extremely important topic, especially during the civil rights movement. So I would say that the first-time voter would lean towards Biden, but not all of them. we have a conglomeration of youth groups that are also working for Trump. So there would be a divide, but I would say that it would be much more towards Biden-Harris.
All right, thank you. David?
Yeah, I was going to interject on a couple points here. First of
Please.
all, on the youth voter question is very interesting. I'd point out that overall voter turnout in the United States is generally much lower than in India. I predict a record turnout this year, but that it will still remain much lower than in India. There is also a very strong relationship between age and voting, with older people voting at much higher rates than young people for a variety of reasons. Young people in recent years have been very heavily Democratic, as Dr. Goswami described. But in terms of the Asian American community, it has been a fascinating trend, because in 1992, the Asian American community actually leaned Republican. Now, there's been obviously a lot of immigration since then, so we're not, and obviously generational change, so we're not describing necessarily quite the same people, particularly among the fastest growing group in America. But nonetheless, since then, what's striking is the level of change, and that Asian Americans have gone to from leaning Republican to now leaning quite heavily Democratic. And particularly in the 2018 congressional elections, the shift, the continuing shift, I should say, towards the Democrats seem to have played a role in the Democrats picking up several congressional seats. Indeed, about half of the seats the Democrats picked up seem to contain rather high percentages of Asian Americans. And I would point particularly to a number of the seats in Orange County, California, which was once the Republican bastion in the state, and now has not a single Republican representing it. And it's just striking. Now, if you look among South Asians, the data by national origin somewhat varies, but also shows that, has been mentioned that, Asian Americans as a group, and particularly Indian Americans, are the most educated and highest income group in America. Which makes, frankly, voting Democratic, which is the group that has been, which is the party that unquestionably tends to favor higher taxes on wealthier people. But I think what comes into this is precisely the identity issues, that that sort of the continued attacks on racial minorities have not played well, particularly well in the Asian community. In terms of Kamala Harris, I think that's generally played well among Indians. Sri Lankans be interesting to see, because I don't know how the Sinhalese will feel about a Tamil vice presidential candidate. I've been told that some were less keen on her presidential candidacy. I don't know now if South Asianness will take over, because these differences often become much more muted in the diaspora, because often, cultural commonalities often become much more important, though I have a feeling others on the panel can talk about this with much more authority than I. I think this is really an important partisan trend that's really quite striking. Asian Americans are concentrated in some swing states, but not all of them, or some states that could, it's interesting, California is not a swing state, obviously, but, Texas and Georgia are states where the Democrats are making moves, and Virginia is a state that used to be Republican that no longer is.
Thank you. Anybody?
I would like
Yeah,
to say
Kim, go right ahead. You please
I
go.
think for Vice President Biden, or whatever he would be or won't be, or whatever it is, I think, there's like a checkbox, where you tick off on a checklist. Before, in the 1960s, it was ticket balancing. So that's why you have presidents like President Kennedy picking vice presidents like Johnson because you needed the South, and Kennedy knew he wouldn't get the South. So you had ticket balancing, which was a very important issue in the 1960s. Today, it's very different because there's no ticket. I mean, there is ticket balancing, but there are other reasons that kind of play into the way in which you ticket balance. For Obama, for instance, it was, everyone said that he was not old enough to be president. He was not, he did not have enough experience, and therefore he picked someone like Joe Biden. Joe Biden, the experienced vice president, senator, etc., picked someone like Kamala Harris. Now, for Kamala Harris, someone like Kamala Harris, it's the women vote, which Joe Biden really needs and really wants to hit at. And it's something like what John McCain tried doing in 2008 with having Sarah Palin as his running mate. Someone much younger than himself, a woman from the state of Alaska, which, whatever, but, someone like that. So someone to kind of excite your base and move forward. So I think what Joe Biden is doing is, one, he's garnering the women voters, and two, it's also your minority groups and all, which play a very important role in any election, because, I mean, your minorities account for a lot. So, yeah.
Thank you. Rolly, do you have a comment? Can we move on if you don't?
No, go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
Folks, we are approaching the closing time, but one last question before we call it a day. President Trump has already hinted that he may not accept the election results, and that how serious is that risk? That is one. And we have a question from Ms. Pakhi asking whether, if Joe Biden is declared the winner, after all the votes are tabulated, could President Trump mount a legal challenge and stop stop Biden from assuming office? Although here, before the 20th of January, I think it's in the first week of December that the Electoral College results will be out, right? If anybody would like to comment on that.
Well, I don't want to comment on it, but I will. It's part of the, it's depressing, okay? Because it's part of the depressing decline of, I often say, I've talked about democracy on various trips been privileged to talk about it for the US Department of State around the world. And, I've often said that, we learned from the 2000 election that, democracy is not like a train that you arrive at the station, you get off and you're done, okay? That it's something you constantly have to work on. The train is now moving backwards, okay? That we are now no longer adhering to the norm of that, that the President of the United States is saying that he can't lose if it's a fair election, it's bizarre that, particularly that the incumbent is claiming the election will be stolen. I mean, normally it's the challenger who is claiming this. But essentially that he's undermining confidence in our electoral procedures, which, look, could they be improved? Sure. But are they basically sound? Absolutely, okay? Is depressing. The fact that he and the Republicans are going to court to try and limit people from voting, to use every advantage to try and limit Democrats from casting ballots where they can, is depressing. This is not a good sign for my country. And I am, frankly, just as an American, it depresses me because, what I like to think about Election Day is that, it's the one day when the politicians all have to, the same thing as in India. It's the one day where the politicians all have to shut up. We get to speak, and the people vote, and we have our say and tell them. Okay, but this is it's very concerning, and it's bad.
Any other colleague?
I can jump in for a second.
Please.
I agree. It's depressing and horrific to see this happening in America today. This is not something that we ever expected to see, not in my lifetime. And seeing the lines for early voting shows how much they have subverted the process. I do think that two things. One is that I'm concerned about what's going to happen on election day itself. I hope that we don't have militias with guns showing up at polls trying to stop people from voting. This is something we have not really been seeing in the past. And I'm hoping that law enforcement will make sure that this is not something that happens. Very, very outright voter intimidation is a concern. I do think that once the election is done, the numbers do show that it should be heading towards Biden in the polls. If and when Biden and Harris win the election, and this is all done and everything calms down, which I do believe eventually it will, then I do think it's very important that we pay attention to this for future elections, solidifying what is the electoral process. How do we ensure that this subversion of democracy does not continue into the future? How do we make sure that people have the capability to vote and protect their ability to vote, and without these capricious last minute laws and rules and undermining of their being able to submit the vote. So I think that's something that we have to look at as an actual issue, a political issue to cover after the election.
Yeah, so if Kim doesn't have anything, I'll jump in here. Okay, so I think I agree with David and Rolly that when you listen to the first debate, and I listened to both the town halls, Trump's and Biden, to just have an objective understanding of where they were. The one concern I have is that what the Trump campaign must have realized that they will be losing the election. So what they are trying to do is discredit the process in terms of creating apprehension, especially in their voter base, that there is fraud, there is mail-in fraud, the election is not going to be fair. I think signaling from the level of the president, I think that creates societal division and dissension. And I think what Trump has probably not, President Trump has not probably got over is that he lost the popular vote by 3 million votes and just won the Electoral College. And I think what he's trying to do here is that if Biden, and that's my suspicion, I might be proven wrong, that he wants to create a situation where the Biden presidency lacks the legitimacy. And so I think that's one of the biggest, intentions out here. Now, in terms of whether he will accept, there's a question here, especially from Hockey, that will he try to stop the inauguration? I don't think so. I have much more faith in American institutions. I think don't underestimate America and overestimate Trump. So I think the transition of power will be peaceful. I think Trump will have to leave when he loses the election, no matter what he does and tries to do. And I think America has robust enough democratic institutions, a free press that will ensure that he leaves office. So I still would not underestimate the power of the American democracy in that context.
I would like to say something.
Please.
So I agree with all our other panelists. Yes, there is a lot of voter subversion going on, and there's this air of fear that has been happening. And it did happen in 2016 as well, where he said that he would not accept any other victory other than him winning. And if Hillary Clinton won, then it would be a problematic election, and there would be that there would be dirty dealings and so on and so forth. But it would be interesting to see, because if it actually gets thrown into the House, whether what could happen in that case. I mean, whether it could be, this is also me trying to answer a couple of my doubts as well, whether actually if they don't get It doesn't get, they're both neck and neck, whether it actually can be thrown into the House or it can't, because we only have 2 candidates and not 3 or something like that. That would be really something, because I mean, there was a time when the House of Representatives did decide on a presidential election. I think it was John Quincy Adams or one of those. I think it was one of the John Quincy Adams. So I think it was during one of those elections that the House actually had a decision to make. And if they're both neck and neck and they both somehow get that to that point, Trump should, if that were to happen, or if that even could happen, I think Trump would be really, really afraid, because the House is in the hands of the Democrats at this point. So,
yeah. But in the House, the voting doesn't occur that way. In the House, if it went to the House, God forbid, because very impressive knowledge of American history. After the Quincy Adams election ended what was known as the era of good feelings and began sort of a new partisan era. The era of backbiting, I don't know what you want to call it. But we're already in the era of extreme polarization, okay? And so the House votes by state delegation. So California gets 1 vote, Wyoming gets 1 vote. The Republicans currently have a majority of state delegations based on their dominance of rural states. So in fact, the Democrats are concentrating on trying to make sure that, precisely because of what you discuss, in case there's some reason to win a majority of state delegations, though that's probably unlikely. But frankly, if it goes to the House, things have probably gone pretty bad at that point already. And the division in America will be just, I don't even want to think about. But yeah, I mean, I'm leaning towards, as Dr. Goswami said, that I think that most likely what she said will be the outcome, and that the institutions will hold. And also, I think what people are hoping for is that we will have a definitive enough outcome that we won't have really two really claimants to the throne, shall we say. So we will see.
Well, thank you ever so much. It was music to my ears when Dr. Goswami says that don't underestimate the nation, the great country of the US, and don't overestimate President Trump or an individual. I would say not just on the behalf of the US, but all democracies, from your lips to God's ears. It is the institutions that matter more than anything else. And in India, we have also seen, to an extent, a similar phenomena that when a party, any party is in power and we have the electronic voting machines, the result goes in the favor. Electronic voting machines are perfect. And if the results don't go in their favor, then there is something, the electronic voting machines are rigged. And you have even the National Party, which has been in power for 60 years, saying that. So, well, these are the joys and challenges of democracy. But I was pretty shocked, and I thought it was an illegality, but not in the American system, when President Trump says publicly, calls upon his voters to vote twice, once through the postal ballot and once in person. I mean, I have not heard any Democratic leaders saying that and getting away with that. In India, it would have been a reason for disqualification. And thank God for the election commission that we have. But these are not normal times. One thing I see is that all the 4 academics that we have today, panelists, are not going to vote Trump. So that is for sure. It shows that the academia, at least, is very solidly democratic, which is one of the conclusions I draw. But also, I am very grateful to all of you for touching upon the core issues, for your candor, for your insights, for your thoughtfulness. And David, what you say about your comment, I'm going to use it somewhere along the line, that the train seems to be moving backwards. And the analogy that democracy is not like a train where you get off, you reach the destination and just get off. It's a process and it needs to be nurtured. Could not have hoped for a more understanding set of colleagues. You have been very generous. I thank you from the core of my heart for being so supportive. And I have learned a lot from this interaction. So would all the other participants have. Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you very much for being so understanding. And now we have finally the Master of Ceremonies, Paki, emerging mysteriously. Very good to see you, Paki, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks a lot. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Paki, and first of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to welcome you in the start due to some technical glitch. But I, of course, take this opportunity to welcome you all as our extended family. To us, all of you are not just speakers for this particular session, but all of you are our very own family members. Talking about today's session, it was undoubtedly very insightful, and it wouldn't have been possible if Ambassador Vishnu Prakash sir wouldn't have agreed to chair this particular session. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to chair the session.
Sure.
And he obviously does not need any sort of introduction because his name is more than enough. But still, 1% of you who failed to recognize him over here, I'd like to formally introduce him. Ambassador Prakash has served as High Commissioner to Ottawa, Ambassador to Seoul, official spokesperson of Foreign Office, and Consul General to Shanghai. He has also done postings in Moscow, New York, Tokyo, Islamabad, etc. He is now a foreign affairs analyst and commentator with a special focus on Indo-Pacific region. It has been absolute matter of honor, sir, to have you chair this discussion. I'd also like to thank all the speakers for making this session comprehensive with their knowledge. We're glad that you could take some time out from your busy schedules and be a part of this session to make it smell success. In addition to it, I'd also like to thank the audience for constantly supporting us, putting forward their questions, liking, commenting, and sharing this live video on Facebook. Thank you all for joining us today. And I personally look forward to welcoming you all, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash sir, and all the speakers in here in person in some webinar or in some seminar organized by NIICE post the COVID-19 crisis. Till then, take care. Thank you, everyone.